I used to believe that the Tuttle name was more unique than it is. And I thought this until I was sent back to New York State on a project with the company I was with at the time. And just on a whim, thought I'd look in the phone book to see if there were any other Tuttles. Well, my surprise was that not only was there a Tuttle, but there were pages of Tuttles. And in our genealogical research, we've discovered that the Tuttles came from England originally, but then stayed primarily on the East Coast in New York, upstate New York.
Dad grew up in Manti and had, I guess he had a rather austere bringing up as well. I think he worked hard, and Grandpa raised sheep, and they had a garden. I remember they had a nice garden. I remember the smell of the corn and the tomatoes as a young child, and that's about the only memory I have of that is the smell. Whenever I smell new corn, I think of Grandpa and Grandma Tuttle's family. Or when I smell a fresh tomato straight off the vine, I think of their farm, their little garden.
We would go to Manti and see where he lived. And so, yes, they would talk about our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great and tell us where we came from, and that we had a sense of faith and of a heritage that we had to live up to.
The connection to my dad, our ancestry as a Tuttle ancestry really, for me, kind of begins and ends with him. He was the defining element of what it meant to be a Tuttle. He always told us boys that if it weren't for us, there would be no continuation of his line. And so he didn't have any brothers, and I don't think any uncles, but he didn't have any uncles or brothers, and so really we were the only ones to continue down that line that came through him.
Dad's mother taught him a lot. I think she was a big part of his life in how to elocute and speak up and be perfected in his abilities to communicate. I think he learned a lot of faith in his household.
He taught us that the most valuable, the most precious thing you have is your name and the reputation assigned or attached to that name, and that it was precious. And so at least it was inculcated into me that was something that I needed to guard and protect.
The name represents integrity and hard work. And my grandmother Tuttle, my dad would say, would rather wear out than rust out. And she did.
The first time I realized that being the son of a general authority was my first experience in the tabernacle. Back when he was called, I was only 8 years old. I think it's the first time I'd ever been in the tabernacle. And I remember we went through an underground area, and we went through this round cave-like entrance through the basement of the tabernacle.
I enjoyed being able to go with my family to the Temple Square, and then we'd go through the tunnel into the tabernacle. On the way there was the translation department, and I remember Dad telling this story about how nervous the translators were when it was time for LeGrand Richards to speak.
I remember after conference Sunday evening, we would all gather together as a family and talk about which talk impressed us and what we learned. And for one thing, we had to listen to conference so that we could have at least one talk that we could remember and say.
Being the son of a general authority from age young until whenever, I didn't think anything of it, really. I mean, we didn't know any different because I was only 12 or so when he was called as a general authority. And nothing really changed. We still had our chores and our work and our times together.
Mom told the story the first time she'd ever heard the name was a funny, comical movie she'd seen called The Tuttles in Tahiti. And then she met a Ted Tuttle.
All my life, he was a general authority. Before I was born, he was. So to me, that was normal. He was always gone on weekends, and that's just how it was. He was home on Mondays sometimes. And, you know, we knew we would work harder on those days. And so that was just normal. You know, we got to go into conference and got to sit in the tabernacle, and I would meet a boy and he'd say, Tuttle. And I knew exactly what was going to happen, you know. And he'd say, are you related to Elder Tuttle? I would say, yes. Then I would wait, and sure enough, would you like to go out? You know. So anyway, it was fun.
My dad has always said that even if you're a general authority, you still have to put your pants on one leg at a time. And so that kind of added some reality to the whole mystery of being a general authority's family in any way.
It was a positive experience. It helped me to want to represent the Tuttle name.
I felt like I was always under the spotlight. I was always critiqued for being a GA's son. And that had a certain responsibility and a certain mantle with it. But I always felt a responsibility to honor the name, and so I did my best to, you know, uphold that.
I have great memories of the times we played together. Dad, he was quite a water skier, and nobody really knew this about him, but he was quite a water skier, and he always skied with his straw hat on, you know, because he had a head that, you know, he didn't want to leave exposed to the sun too much. And so he'd wear his straw hat, and he said, I'll never get it wet. And he never did. He'd ski from the shore all the way out and around, and he'd ski right back into the shore.
We would swim in the creek behind our house, build a dam. I still say I swim like a fish because I got used to swimming in the creek, going around the rocks.
Our rope swing was probably the most fun that we had in the backyard.
When we lived in this house here on Forest Bend, there was a creek behind, and every 24th of July we would build a dam in the creek. And our legs would freeze and they'd go numb, and by the time they were numb, then we could spend more time in the water because it was still freezing. And then we would get a watermelon and put it in the creek so it would be cold, and we'd have a barbecue that evening. And
There were all kinds of apple trees and peaches and pears and things to climb.
we also had horses, and I loved riding horses. And in those days, the hills back up here were not covered with houses, and we could go riding back there.
I especially enjoyed horseback riding, and so I was glad that we had enough acreage that we could have quarter horses.
We had more work. And we made it fun, driving tractors and burning limbs and whatever. Irrigating would turn it into fun. We had a life of strife and grief, and the younger ones had it easy.
Work was just part of the being a Tuttle. And I think actually, in honesty, I probably had it easier than the rest of the guys. And they've ribbed me about it a few times, I think, because you had it easy, you know. You had it in the posh days.
It was a legacy, actually, because Dad, rather than after he was called as a general authority in 1958, we moved to Pleasant Grove after an aborted attempt to move to Mapleton. And rather than move us to Salt Lake to make it closer to Dad's work, he commuted for all those years from 58 till 61. And so that we could have the experience of working on a farm, learning how to grow things, and trim pruned fruit trees, and irrigate, and take care of animals.
Chores and work were kind of a bad word for me, because it seemed like there wasn't a break, and I had to create the break. It was like my friend Spencer Packer would come up to the house and he'd want to play, and he would say, "John, let's go play." And I'd say, "Well, I can't. I got all these chores to do." And he said, "Well, I'll help you." So he'd help me with these chores, and when I'd get done with that, I'd say, "Well, I have all these." And he goes, "Well, when can you go play?" So when all these are done. And I came to realize that he stopped coming up because my chores didn't end.
I guess the kind of fun that some people think of is like going to Disneyland or going somewhere, doing something that costs money. But I don't remember doing those kinds of things. I guess work was fun. Work was fun. Work was fun. Work was fun. That's what we did. I know I got to drive the tractor when we were picking apples and gathering up the bushels of apples, or baling hay, horse riding.
If you ask my kids, they'll know that I carry on that tradition very well. I was just always by my dad's side, working alongside.
Seemed like there was lots of weeds to do, lots of pulling, but remembering back, it was a great experience. At the time, it was drudgery to haul rocks and shovel manure and things like that.
But he would come home, be home by 5:30 when he was in town, and by 5:33 he was in his overalls and dragging me out the door. "Let's go." And I'm downstairs trying to watch cartoons or something, and he wants me to come out and work with him.
Milking the cow was a big deal in our family. I mean, I was the only kid in high school that milked a cow. Okay, that was a source of embarrassment and so forth. I mean, I don't look back on it now that way, but at the time, you know, you always hope that you've washed all the smell off you before you got to school and things.
Milk cows. And that was a blessing and a curse, of course, depending on the coldness of the day.
My brothers milked the cow, except for when they went deer hunting with Dad. Then I got to milk the cow. And I developed nice, strong forearms from doing that.
Bob was really good at doing a little propaganda with me, because he would bring me out to milk the cows when I first started, and he would say, "You're so good at milking the cows. You do that so fast." And so I started getting confidence, like, I get out there and milk the cows real fast. And then he would say, "Well, do you think you can do it by yourself?" "Oh, I don't know, Bob, I don't know." "Yeah, you can do it, let's try." And so eventually he weaned himself of having to milk the cows because I was able to. I don't know how good of a job I did that and transferring that to Boyd.
Oh, repairing fences, digging fence posts, stringing wire, putting up pole fences. In Pleasant Grove, we lived on a farm, 7-acre farm. And that's where I first learned how to drive the tractor, which we still have right next door. Same old 8N Ford tractor.
When it was hay baling time, we would get our hay hooks, stick it in the bale, and throw it up onto the trailer of hay.
Taking irrigation turns, once a week we would get our irrigation turn, and for 3 hours or 5 hours, whatever the time was, our turn would come. And when the turn comes, you have to be there. And it might be 3 in the morning, it might be, middle of the day. But, we got used to knowing what it means when we got the irrigation turn, and we'd get up in the middle of the night and go up the stream and make sure it was cleared. And this whole property that we're on now was all flood irrigated back in those days.
Digging ditches, putting up the fences, digging post holes. Except in our garden, we had great soil. I bet it goes down 8 feet of good soil. And that was easy to dig. But when you were over on this side, where this house is now, it was rock and stone, and we put a lot of post holes and fences in this area.
We had an arm wrestling in seminary one time, and I was the girl champion of our seminary class in arm wrestling. I blamed it all on having to milk the cow.
We also had sheep, though. And the interesting thing there was my grandfather, Whitaker, Mom's father, helped us buy some old ewes. And they were so old this was probably their last lambing. And they required help when it came time to give birth. And so Dad was gone somewhere, and I was out there pulling the lambs out by their feet.
We had chickens and dogs and horses and cats, pigs at one time, sheep, calves, turkeys, just all of that kind of stuff, and then just fixing things, fixing cars.
And Dad always told us, I didn't get the cow to save money. It's to teach you boys responsibility.
When the kids grew up and left home, then the animals left too. It was a great way to grow up, learning about care of animals and the daily feeding and chores. And of course there was the garden where we would have plenty of things to do through the planting season to the harvest season.
It was just part of what you had to do to make the family operate and to make things happen the way they needed to. Lots of children, lots of chores to be done, a farm, animals to be fed, eggs to gather, cow to milk, horses to feed. We just had a farm, and we had to take the responsibility that went along with that. And we just worked together as a family. That's the way a family operates.
Spencer would come up to play, and he'd say, "Can you play?" And I'd say, "Yes." So then I would go play. And then if I didn't get them done, my dad he wouldn't ever really yell at me or get mad necessarily. He would just be disappointed that they weren't done.
I do remember a time when we lived in Provo, and I had a girlfriend. Her name was Judy Brimley. And I liked to go visit her, and I had to be home at a certain time. I had to be home at 4:30 this one day. Well, I was late, and so Dad said, "You're late." I said, "I know, but I ran all the way." He said, "Well, you know that you need to go out to the weeping willow tree and get a willow, because you need, this is your punishment. You need to get a little willow whipping because you were late." So I thought, oh my gosh. So I went out to the weeping willow tree, and I got the best willow I could find, because if I was late, I was an obedient daughter, I was going to have to take the punishment. So I got the best willow I could find. I took off all the leaves except for the very end, so it would be a nice little willow. And I took it in to Dad, and I said, "Here's the willow." And I was ready for my little willow whipping. I think I got the smallest little willow whipping, but to me, my punishment was to go out and get it. And I was feeling the punishment as I walked out and as I walked back. So anything after that was nothing, because I'd already repented 100 times. I was going to be more obedient the next time.
The worst thing was if Mom ever cried. Oh my goodness. And she did a few times, because we were just stinkpots and we deserved it. But she just cried. She said, "I've tried everything and you won't do a thing." And so she cried, and then we were just like, John and me are, "Okay, come on, let's get it done,
I don't think that they really disciplined any of us, really, because I think we all just were basically good kids, basically. I don't think they were disciplinarians. And I've carried that on into my family.
Dad drove a lot, and he would take one of us on a trip if it would fit into the schedule okay. He would point out things, especially deer, along the way. If he saw a deer with antlers, he'd say, I don't know how you count it, 2-pointer, 3-pointer, whatever.
I do recall one time coming through Thistle Canyon coming back from Manti. It was in the wintertime. The roads were slick. Dad was always watching for deer and was watching the sides of the canyon as we were coming through there. He was driving, and all of a sudden the car just went right off the road and into the embankment, down the embankment. And the first thing he says was, "Weren't you watching, Marne?" Because he would rely upon her to kind of keep the car steered in the right place while he checked for the deer.
We would drive everywhere. That was the only way we ever went anyplace. And Dad would tell us stories. The cave. Stories of the cave, and we would love it. We would all just sit and listen.
It was a long story. It never ended. It never had an ending. We would get through different scenarios. I don't really remember why it was the cave. I think that's where it started. But it had ended up going everywhere, across the plains and fighting all sorts of interesting Indians and cowboys and dragons and pterodactyls. And
I was the youngest one, and so I probably didn't get the whole series. I kind of came in midstream somewhere before I reached consciousness and awareness of what was going on. But I just he had a way of just capturing us with these stories about Johnny Whack and Lisa Pack and Boydie Whack. And
Johnny Whack and Lisa Sack and Boydie Pack. And
sometimes I was Clary Sack or Clary Whack. But I remember Diane was always Gwendolyn. I thought that was a very fancy name.
That was an amazing story. We all loved it.
The cave started, and I will set my little brothers straight and sisters on this one, with Timothy, Gwendolyn, and Roberto. And I was Gwendolyn, Timothy was David, and Roberto was my brother Bob.
We're kind of like a group of pioneers is the feeling I got. And we'd come down and we'd cross these rivers and we'd have to build rafts and put our wagon onto the raft and get it across the other side while avoiding the treacherous rapids.
We were shipwrecked or stuck on this island, a wonderful island, that we made our own home in and invented things from anything we needed, we would invent on this island.
One of my favorites was when he told about going into a cave, and inside we found, as a family, some rocks that glowed, and so those were the ones we were able to take into our own home, because it was kind of a cabin type thing, and so then we had light.
And these big whirbirds with their big wingspan would lift us up into the air and take us wherever we needed to go. We could guide them. And these whirbirds were a marvelous mode of transportation, and they filled many adventures in this story.
he could have told it for hours and we would have been, I still have memories of just the visions that I would create in my mind. I don't know how he made them up. I tried to do the same thing with my kids, and I would get stumped, trying to think of more creative ways to express it. But
When we could get Dad in town and we got our chores done and we cleaned up or did whatever the requirement was, we did it because we knew we'd get a story. So he could ask anything and we would do it.
That is one of those things that when I talk to my grandchildren, they'll say, tell us a story. And so I started telling them the cave. And I've told my children that too.
One thing I do have a memory of is going downtown and window shopping during Christmas time with all the decorations and so on, and walking down the sidewalks with my family, looking through the windows.
When we were in the Packer home, we got up and saw presents and things, and then Mom and Dad looked out the window and said, oh, Santa has left something else. And we looked out the window, and there was a little Shetland pony with a big red bow on her neck. And that was our prize that Santa had left outside, and it was just so fun. And so we would ride her around, and when we were littler, she was, it was more, we fit her better. As we got older, our feet would almost touch the ground. But we also got a cart that was just her size for a little horse, and so we would put her behind that and go up and down the lane behind Shirah.
Brigham City. I was maybe 5, and everything was magical in those days. And I think that was the year I got an erector set, and that was just magical to me. The idea of putting things together and then having a little motor that would run a pulley and raise and lower things. And I think that was the same year that Utah had one of the largest snowstorms ever, and the snow was so high, Dad had shoveled a path from the street to the door of the house, and the snow was piled higher than deeper than he was, so it was 6 or 8 feet.
My parents had gathered us all up to go in the car, and we went to look at some of the ice lights and Christmas scenes. And as we drove back over the cattle guard into our driveway, I saw a tall, white-haired, red-suited man going into our front door, and I couldn't believe it. We quickly parked and we followed right through the door, and there was Santa Claus in our front room. He even knew all of our names. He had white, full hair on the top of his head. He filled out the red Santa suit and left us all a gift, and then he was gone.
I just remember getting some pajamas and Levi's. And the Levi's were always too big, and I couldn't wash them. It was like, no, you can't wash those because we need them to last longer. I could never figure that out because I didn't think washing ruined them. But for some reason, I didn't just say, well, I'm going to wash these anyway, throw them in the washer, or go out and get them dirty right away and say, oh, they need to be washed.
Down in South America, in Uruguay, when we had a Christmas around the world on our block down there on the Manzana Mormona, and each home took a different country, and ours was the American Christmas. And we did luminarios around on all of the sidewalks and on the rooftops where they were all flat, and lit candles every night. People would come and they would look in the windows of our homes. Our part was a Christmas tree, an American Christmas tree decorated up, and there was a armchair sitting there by it, and I think they had like either a train set or something on the floor area, and probably a couple of dolls. And my little brother and sister, Boyd and Lisa, had fallen asleep in this chair. And it looked just like part of the display. It wasn't meant to be that way, but there they were, asleep in the chair in the Christmas display.
That first Christmas was different than any that I'd ever experienced in my 11 years. Because there was no snow, there was no, what I'd been used to.
There was the ever useful shovel that Dad gave Mom one Christmas, and we've kind of carried that tradition on. Occasionally I'll give my children something very useful as a Christmas gift.
From the beginning, our trip to South America was an adventure. And this is how Mom and Dad were going on an adventure. And I've carried that same wording on with my children. Whenever we're going to do something that might be a little unusual, I'd say, well, we're going to do an adventure walk or an adventure ride or an adventure.
We had to take everything with us that we needed. Furniture, we took cars, 2 cars, clothing, just everything. We took it on a boat, big ship. I still remember the name of that, USS Argentina, Moore McCormick Lines. It took us 2 weeks to travel from New York down a couple stops to Uruguay.
We stopped, of course, on the way in Rio, in Brazil. Saw the big Christus statue and sugar loaf, and were met there by the mission president, Grant Bangerter, who took us up and showed us the sights. And then we were on the ship again and down to Montevideo.
On our way to South America, being on the big ship, and I think it was Lisa and I that got lost. Or my parents thought we were lost, and the captain or one of the boat people, found us, and I was 4 and she would have been 3. And I remember that they had us sitting up on a table, and we had an ice cream cone that we were licking, and when our parents came over and found us. So I thought it was great that I had my ice cream.
On the SS McCormick, I remember going into the restaurant and we could choose whatever food we wanted. I remember having donuts for breakfast.
It was a horribly busy time for Mom, and getting everything taken care of. She had just had my little brother Boyd. This was way before there were such things as area presidents. It was kind of the beginning of that, when general authorities were asked to go out into the world and regulate the church. That was my dad's word. He'd always say, I've got to regulate the affairs of the church, and that was his job, to regulate. And I remember reading later in the scriptures that there's actually a verse in there that says, regulate the affairs of the church.
Of course, the language was new, and we were green. So green, we were blue. And the very first thing they did was take the older kids to a dance. This was a dance in the branch there. And off we went, and not knowing the language and not knowing the dances, we survived somehow.
I went to a British school. We would stand up when the headmaster came in, and we would recite the English prayers in beginning of every school day. And I got a good education. I learned a lot about Chaucer and Shakespeare and proper spelling and writing and things to do with the English language.
I remember going to school wearing the uniforms in the British school and in the Uruguayan American school. And then it was the days when they were in the cleaners that you got to choose your own clothes.
I was supposed to take a nap one day, and I did not want to take a nap. And so I went down to my room, but apparently I could open the window and crawl out of it was a basement or sub-basement, half basement. I don't know. I could crawl out and be onto the grass of the window. And so that's what I did, expecting to go to my friend's house. And I had no shoes on. I was barefoot, and I stepped on a bee. And so now I was in pain and dying, and I would have to tell my mom so that she could help me and make me feel better, but then she would know that I wasn't taking a nap, and so it was very conundrum.
We would have general authorities come to visit, and Dad was giving a talk, and he was talking about how something happened very slowly over a period of time. And then he would pause for the translator to translate. And of course, for slowly, you could use the word lento or lentamente. And for some reason, the translator could not think of the word to put in that space. And my dad had learned this 50-cent word from Elder Bench, which was paulatinamente. It meant slowly, but it was like the really most elegant way to express slowly. And so while the interpreter was waiting or trying to think of the word, Dad just put on his smile, and he knew this word. He said, paulatinamente. And the congregation just rolled in the aisles. They couldn't believe that here this man was needing a translator, and he came up with the best word, the 50-cent word, to put in the slot. It was great. He eventually learned enough Spanish that he could give a pretty decent talk on his own. And I know what he missed most of all probably was just flipping through the Book of Mormon when the Spirit directed him to go to a part, and he would turn to that and read it. I just remember him doing that, and he'd go on with his talk, and then something else would hit, and he'd flip back through, and he'd say, I know it's on the right side. It's on the right side. So he'd look on the right side, or it was on the left side, and he would know which side of the page it was on, Maybe not the exact verse, but he knew right which place it was on the page. Mother learned really nice Spanish during those 4 years. And she would always give her testimony. Dad would always turn to Mom and have her do her talk. It was a nice relationship.
In the backyard, there were 2 trees. One was a lemon tree and one was a tangerine tree. And that was a great novelty for me.
Their tradition down there is to come up and not shake your hand, but kiss you twice on each cheek. And so this girl came running up to me and kissed me on both cheeks, and I thought, well, I was very shy.
So I left my horse, my car, and my girl in that order. And it was a relief to kind of be free of that entanglement and engage in a new adventure.
I was surrounded by missionaries, wonderful missionaries, handpicked especially to come and be my dad's assistants. And they lived right in our home. They lived downstairs, and our family slept upstairs, and everything else was done on the main floor. All of our dinners were together, and the missionaries were in charge of taking us places when our parents were out of town. I was in charge of the missionaries. I felt that I was in charge of the missionaries because I was in charge when Mom and Dad would go away.
I had a friend over there, Mark Timothy, and we would hang around together and get in mischief together. And we would go over each other's houses and take naps. And after about 20 minutes of playing around in his room, would rub our eyes real hard and go out and say, "We've napped now, can we go out and play?" And we would steal Jell-O from each other's house, and we would go out and sit on the curb and eat Jell-O. And we had an armadillo as a pet and a wiener dog. And I think the wiener dog ended up killing our armadillo.
We caught an armadillo in the field not far from us, and we tried to keep it alive.
And so across the street we had an open field and had all these empty wells in it. And so we took the armadillo out by its tail and dropped it in the well. That was its burial place.
I made friends with other Americans that lived on the Monsanto Mormona. Prior to that, we had lived in some other homes, so we weren't always by our close American friends, but also made some good friends of the natives, or Argentine, Uruguayans, I mean. They weren't really natives, but they were from there, and I've still kept in contact with them. Matter of fact, some have moved here to Utah.
I just remember enjoying my time there, having wonderful experiences, gaining a strong testimony of the gospel, having wonderful meetings to go to and to hear Dad speak when he was in town.
The chapel was near the beach, and I remember looking for snails in the hedges. And then I was baptized in the Atlantic Ocean on January 8th by my dad.
Leaving at age 16 from a rather sheltered life to experience the big world has made all the difference. And I've just been rereading that story in Mark Grover's book about that whole experience in South America, and it's pretty amazing to me that, number one, we could go as a family and essentially launch a new life in a new place, and really not knowing anything. We didn't know the language, the culture. I was sitting around and waiting for something to happen, and here came President Hugh B. Brown on a tour of South America, and I was 18 at the time. He said, "Take a walk with me." And so we went down to a corner on the Block H where the mission home and South American mission home and other homes were located. And there were 3 roads, one here, 2 there. He says, "Now life is like this. You can choose a road and go down it, but then if you don't continue on that road, you have to come back and start again." And then he said, "Did you know that you can go on a mission at age 18? And I said, "No, I did not realize that." He says, "That's true. If you're a son of a mission president and are out in the field, you can go at age 18. And that was a good solution because I was just not doing anything really, academics or mission-wise. So not long after that, a letter came from President McKay calling me to the Andes mission.
A lot of the missionaries that came over to be my dad's assistants were very special. They were, like I say, hand-picked, top missionaries from all over South America. There were 7 missions, and my dad would go around and give each mission a turn to send over their best missionaries. There was Elder Cook, an Elder Cook that we all know and love. There were others. There was an Elder Hoops. We would always take the missionaries to the airport to tell them goodbye, and we did the same thing for Elder Hoops. And he left, and we just said goodbye, a handshake, just like you always do with missionaries. Got back in the car and started on the way back home, and my dad looked in the rearview mirror and he said, "Diane, you look really sad." I said, I am sad. I miss Elder Hoops. He said, well, did you give him a hug goodbye? And I said, no, he's a missionary. He said, well, you should have. And so I thought, oh, darn, I missed an opportunity. But it wasn't the next day. Elder Hoops had to go over to Argentina from Uruguay, and the next day I got a letter. It was from Elder Hoops. So I thought, well, this is really nice. And each country that he visited on his way home to teach the home teaching program, he sent me another letter. And so we wrote for a whole year while Elder Hoops was up at school. By this time, Dave Hoops, student government, a big man on campus, and I was writing him, and he was writing me. And then when we finally came home a year later, then we dated at BYU, and then we got engaged and married.
One thing I remember my dad always said was, "This is really living." We were stream fishing, and we were wrapping up the fishing, and I was just dragging my pole in the water, and a fish hooked onto it. And I reeled it in, and I was so excited, and I caught the biggest fish of anybody just by dragging my pole up the river. But we were on horses again, and we were going back, and I was just sitting back in my saddle, leaning back, and just going, this is really living.
Whenever he was eating something really yummy, he would say, this is really living. And he would have a smile on his face, and he'd kind of sit back in the chair and cross his legs. This is really living.
He had very positive, upbeat, witty expressions. And I remember Diane made an apron for one of our family reunions that had a lot of his quotes.
When you're going out the door and you're looking sharp and dapper and on a date or on a whatever outing, and to the girls it was pretty is as pretty does, and to the boys it was handsome is as handsome does.
Smile, smile pretty. Because we would say, Mom, my hair looks awful. I can't go out like this. Just smile pretty. You'll be fine. So we would smile pretty in spite of how we looked and how we felt, and, it would be better. So that was it. Smile pretty.
What Mom would always say every morning, she'd sing a song. Come down and wake us up, or when we came up, she was just always singing, and I'm trying to remember what that song was. Maybe someone else can remember. But it was a happy song.
My dad would frequently say, you doughhead kids, meaning, that's kind of a silly thing to have done. And why did you do that, or why didn't you do the other? And knuckleheads was another one. But mainly he would just say, you are great kids. And that expectation, I think, was more powerful than any discipline he could have meted out in a physical way. Is just the idea that if we were to disappoint Dad and his expectations of us, that would be punishment in itself, and more than adequate.
We would always tell our boys that Tuttles don't quit. They were in sports, and so we said, if you're going to start this sport, then you're going to go through the whole season with this sport. So make sure that you really want to do that, because Tuttles don't quit. And when my son Christopher decided to ride his bike from Colorado to Virginia, we told him, we said, there's a ticket in Virginia for your trip home. But anywhere in between, you have to get your own way home, because Tuttles don't quit.
The name represents being steady. We knew who we were. It helped me stay on the straight and narrow.
The Tuttle name just means a lot to live up to. And yet, not more than you could live up to, but it set a good standard of being honest, of being hardworking, of being faithful, exercising your faith. Knowing that things would be all right if you worked hard enough. There's just a lot to that name that when you stop to think about it, comes to mind and makes you proud.
How can you ever equal the legacy of your ancestors, your progenitors? And I think Dad helped me understand that a little better in a blessing I received while a missionary in Peru. And he was coming through as one of his assignments to interview all the missionaries. And at that point, I asked him for a father's blessing. And in that blessing, he reminded me that, in fact, I did come from solid stock, people who were willing to give their lives for the gospel and who had demonstrated that faith by their works.
The Tuttle name is one of good character, striving to do good, be a leader.
We have a lot of people, as we've talked about our heritage, a lot of people who have gone through so much. And one of the things I have taken from that is if they can do that, then certainly I can do my part. And certainly my children should do their part. And it's that heritage of faith that we have come from. It's something to hold on to, and it's something that is real, so that's what we can hold on to when times get hard and when things are difficult. We can make it. We can do these hard things because others have.
I've always been proud of the Tuttle name. I think it has good legacy, and I think it has a good posterity as well, a good future.
Mom is special. Dad was. And I hope that we can carry that special, unique relationship through the eternities. And I believe we as siblings and our children are, and grandchildren. And it'll continue on. Tuttle is a good name. One that will be remembered for many, many years.
My father was wise beyond his years. And he always, to me, my father was always the same age. And he always seems to have that kind of ageless wisdom that was with him, and a sense of who he was and, you know, his role in the kingdom. And I took that for granted. And in my life, and I always compare and contrast myself with him, you know, and I say, whoa, I'm 49 years old, and, you know, what was Dad doing when he was this age? And, you know, how much further beyond me in, you know, his life and maturity was he?
People really made a connection with him. I hear still people hear them tell me stories about him. And it's always something like, I was on a mission and your father came to see us and he said these things to me. Or, you know, he made that personal connection with people, and they remembered it for the rest of their lives.
Dad had a way to be a conduit for the Lord's love to flow to people around him, and I think that that's one of the reasons that people remember experiences.
My father twinkled. Especially, I remember watching him when he spoke. He would be speaking along, and all of a sudden he'd stop, and he'd smile, and his eyes would just crinkle at the end, and he would get a little smile, and you knew he was going to tell a joke or something funny was happening, so you'd be ready for it. And he would just twinkle.
His face just lit up whenever he was going to tell a story or something wonderful, or remembering something, even if he hadn't said it yet. If he would just think about it, he would begin to smile, and you just anticipate. You just wait. What is it that he's going to tell? Because he has this wonderful smile and this wonderful crinkling of the eyes.
He always wore a hat. Always wore a hat. Outside working, he had a nice dress hat that he'd wear.
He was just someone who was really real. He wasn't pretentious.
He was strong. He had this trick, and we cannot do it. I haven't seen anyone else in my family do it. He could rip a phone book in half. And apparently he learned a little trick that there is, but he rips a phone book. It's a huge phone book, and he can rip it in half. And this he was doing in the later years of his life when he was around. And that was very impressive because I tried. I cannot rip a phone book.
My father is a man of faith. And early on, at the time he was to go on his mission, the bishop said, "You can't go because your parents don't have enough money." And so he went home, told his mother, and she said, "Well, we'll find it." They talked to their friend, Tom Anderson, who was wealthy, and asked if he would back Dad on his mission. And of course he said yes, that he would, no problem. And he returned and told that to the bishop. The bishop says, "That's all I need to know." And so he went on his mission. And the interesting thing is that they never had to call on Tom Anderson, because somehow or another, through faith, his parents found the money he needed each month.
Brother Packer and my dad were the closest of friends. They spent a lot of time together. They kind of followed each other around. They were together in institutes and seminary program. And then when living here in Salt Lake City, they're on the same street and would often get together out in the field and supposedly irrigate, I think, and do their gardening. And yet I would often go see that he was standing there leaning on his shovel, and Brother Packer had his shovel there, and they were just kind of standing and talking. And I once asked my dad, I said, "What do you and Brother Packer talk about while you're out there?" And he kind of became serious. He said, "Well, we talk about all kinds of things."
It's a little harder for me. My father was very loving. He was a very peaceful man, and he also liked to have a lot of fun. And he loved to joke around and to just laugh and, be full of life. And for as much fun as he liked to have, it wasn't expressed in, "Let's go do something fun." It was, "Let's have fun while we're doing the work."
And then fishing, and that's a tradition that my dad had. Fishing and hunting was a big part of his life, and he wanted to pass that along to his boys, and I really cherish the times that we were able to go fishing together. One time we were just here in South Salt Lake, just not too far from here. The place is long gone now. There's condos there now, but there used to be a little river that flowed through, and I remember fishing there one time with John and Dad, and he took us out there and just getting tangle after tangle after tangle. And I just remember Dad's patience to undo that tangle. Because we were kids, we didn't know we'd get it in the tree, and then we'd get it, and tuck to each other. And he'd just undo it, and he didn't argue or yell at us or, anything. And I remember that. I try to, when I go fishing with my boys and have that same experience over and over, I just remember his patience, and that was a great example to me.
Dad was taken way too early. I think we could have learned so much more from him. I was sure that when the prophet asked the church members to pray for him, and that if we would exercise our faith and everything, we would receive blessings. We did receive blessings. I felt a peace that I'd never felt in my life after that. Just the awesome comfort of the comforter just going all over my body. And so that, for me, was a confirmation that things were okay. This is how it was supposed to be. But I still felt that Dad was taken too soon.
He was always smiling. Well, he was happy. Sometimes you could tell when he was worried. But because he seemed like he was always thinking. I don't know if he was thinking about his next talk or the next conference or the next trip he'd go on. But he was just jovial, I guess would be a word. But he wasn't a bubbly jovial. He was just Dad.
He made leather moccasins for all of us children out of leather. He went deer hunting. He saved the hides and had them tanned, and had a leather jacket made out of one of them, and just loved being the explorer type, the worker, the maker of things. He liked to create things.
My father was somebody that I could go to and just talk from my heart. And he would listen, and he would counsel, and he would give me advice. I loved to get his father's blessings. I still have the blessings. My mom, she knew shorthand, and so she would write in shorthand the blessings, and then she would type them up and give them to us. And I still have copies of some of those blessings that he gave, and they're dear to my heart.
He taught how to project when we had to give a talk. His mother would teach him how to do it. He would stand at the back of the room, and we'd have to project well enough so that we could be heard to the back of the room. That was a teaching moment.
The way that I was given to feel capable and responsible, needed and loved.
And as I'm rereading the history of his time in South America, seeing that, in fact, they did things that were impossible to do. It couldn't be done, and yet they did them through faith. So faith is the first characteristic. The second, I think, is a willingness to work long and hard and unstintingly, or in Book of Mormon terms, with unwearyingness.
I remember he would come home, would be sitting around the dinner table, and he would start telling us jokes that he heard in his meetings that day. And I don't know, well, obviously they were church meetings with the other general authorities, and he would come up, and it was always fun to listen to his jokes because, they would always be good ones.
I loved being with him when he was working around with his tools, his hammer and nails. He would have me fetch nails. He'd get me a 10-penny and I didn't know exactly what they were, but he said, just try to figure it out, and I learned about nail sizes, and I loved to help him. I loved to just be around him and let his influence just be there. And I just thought of Mary and Martha. At that time, I wanted to just sit at his feet and listen and watch and learn. I did learn a lot.
I remember spending hours with him because I was the youngest, and so I ended up being with him one-on-one quite a bit during my high school years. We would spend sometimes a long time together without saying a word to each other. I mean, an hour could go by comfortably, and we'd just be completely quiet. But then something would happen along the way, a little quirk of events or something, and when he felt the time was right, I guess, he would just stop for a second, and I said, did you learn that lesson, boy? Did you hear? And he would ask a question that would just prompt something, because I don't think I was that ready to be taught. I was a typical teenage kid. I didn't want, lectures, and he was sensitive to that. He didn't feel like it would do any good to lecture me. But when the moments were right, he taught me about my mother. said, now that's the kind of woman you want to marry. And he said, marry above yourself, Boyd, like I did.
The good thing about my father is when he'd come home, he'd take his tie off, put on his coveralls, and he was home to just work. But looking back now, those were special times.
Dad always liked horses. He liked animals, and so we would have them to help us get responsibility and have to do the work. You know, the boys were always having to milk, and when they would go to scout camp, the girls would take over and milk. And
He also taught me the principle that we shouldn't be too impatient with people who don't get it, or who don't learn, or who do the wrong things. Because he said, boy, don't worry, they'll learn their lesson. He says, life is interesting that way. We can learn in one of two ways. We can learn the easy way or the hard way. But either way, we'll learn. And he taught me to be more tolerant, maybe, of people learning the hard way, and loving of people who have to learn the hard way, because they're going to learn, and they're going to gain the testimony that you learned the easy way. So be patient with them while they learn.
He would certainly reach out in ways that we'll probably never know the full extent of his willingness to counsel, to bless, to be with and strengthen a lot of different people.
Dad taught me an important lesson once when I was 14. We had sheep, and we had 6 of them, and it was time for them to be slaughtered. I would hold the sheep while Dad would cut the sheep's throat and then would bleed it, hang it up, take off the skin, clean it out, and so on and so forth. And so we were doing that, and we had been through, I think we were processing, 4 sheep that day, and we'd done 3. And we got to the 3rd one, and I was prepared to hold it down, and he handed me the knife. And I said, no, I don't do this. I don't do that part. And he gave me that look that said, yes, you will. And I really struggled with that. Don't like to kill animals, did not want to. And I was mad, and I was crying, and I was, upset that he made me do that, and it wasn't fair. And he let me kind of go on that way for a while. And after it was kind of all over and settled down, and then he said, now, Boyd, you didn't want to do that. And that's the way life is sometimes. You have things that you have to do, and you may not want to, and it may not be fun, but you have to do it. No, don't ever forget that.
It was in the winter, and we had a really heavy snowstorm. And normally you milk cows every 12 hours. So 6 in the morning, 6 at night was basically our routine. And for some reason, it was snowing really heavy, but we decided we were having really nice conversation, and it was like 7:30, and we could hear the cow starting to bellow and say, it's time to milk me. And so normally I would be the one that would get up and go out. My dad said, I'll go out and get her started, get her set up. And so he goes out, and I see him coming back. I'm heading out, and he's walking back, and he's crying. I'm thinking, what's going on? Something's really wrong. I said, what's wrong? He said, our barn fell in. And when he built our barn, the one that's down there now, he didn't put as many trusses as he should have. And the heavy, heavy snow collapsed the barn. And he wasn't crying because the barn fell down. He was crying because of the gratitude that he felt, that we weren't there milking the cow, because that would have been the time when the barn collapsed. And it collapsed where we would have been. And I just knew that the love and compassion that he had for us.
We had moved to New York, and we're just kind of getting into that New York life and that world out there. And he only lived for a year after we moved there. But I'll never forget calling home one day, saying, "Dad, you'll never believe this. We drove out, we're out in, this is upstate New York near Palmyra and so forth. It's just all rural up there and farmland." And I said, we drove past these fields that had just freshly been plowed, and the earth was black and rich, and just the steam rising out of it. And I said, "Dad, you would have just loved it," because he loved the soil. He loved to get his hands in the dirt and grow things and plant things. And I said, "You would have loved it, Dad." I said, "You would have gotten out and just picked up the dirt and smelled it." And then he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "Did you?" I said, "No." I just kept on driving. He knew his time was short, and in that time, he wanted to put a pressurized system in so that Mom, without him, would never have to irrigate like that. When the sprinklers came on and we saw it work for the first time, he said, "Boyd, I want you to take a picture of me." So I got there with the snapshot, and he jumped up and he hollered, "Yahoo!" And he fell right down and to his knees. Because he was so weak by then, by the cancer, it wasn't, it was already quite, he was quite ill at that stage. And so he was so overjoyed.
Every time somebody realizes who my dad is, they say, "I remember the time when." And then they have a story to tell, and it's a personal story because somehow they felt they were the focus and the object of his attention at that point.
Every time we meet someone and they know, who my father is, they will have a story about him.
So when Dad was ill, and we all knew it, we all came together and we spent some time with him in October. He passed away in November. We couldn't stay. We all had our lives to continue on with.
And that was a sweet experience to have my brothers and sisters share our testimonies and love for him.
On Thanksgiving, he called us. He called all the children, each and every one. I just immediately knew it was going to be the last time I talked to him. And he didn't have a lot of strength, and he just expressed his love and his, warm feelings. And of course, my mind was just flooded with 1,000 thoughts when I realized, I said, "What do you say in the last conversation you're going to have with your father?" I said, "Dad, I have so many memories." And he said, "That's right. So you go out and make some of your own."
I talked to my dad on the phone the night before he passed away. And I told him at that time, I said, "You can't go. You need to stay. You need to help raise the spirituality of everybody that you meet, because that's what happens when you meet with Dad. You always just felt more spiritually alive and elevated." After the funeral was over, all of the general authorities lined up on either side of the exit door, and the 12 apostles stood on either side, and as our family walked out, they were standing there, showing that respect. That was huge. The prophet came to our family home and talked to us after my dad passed away. He came and talked to us and gave us his love and concern, and kind of told a little bit about the proceedings of the day, how it would unfold, and that was pretty special.
Since he had been so long in the 70s quorum, that we were acquainted with many of them and their families. And it was just good to have that support
Mom and Dad have the opportunity to receive all those sweet love letters, she calls them, that came after he gave his closing talk in the October conference.
Elder Packer, the conference following in April after my father died, when he gave a tribute, as I remember, I don't think it's truly this way, but a lot of the talk was about my dad. And as I have seen how my husband is as a general authority, as a 70, he feels a closeness with his brethren, with Dad and President Packer. They've had that bond, through a lot of years when there were even just fewer general authorities, because of the talk that President Packer gave after he passed away, and expressing his sadness, the loneliness, that he would miss my dad.
My mother is giving. She gives of herself.
My mother is a nurturer. She nurtures everyone, beginning with my father, and then each of us as children, because we each seem to have different nurturing needs. But then she goes beyond to the extended family, her own siblings, her nieces and nephews, grandnieces, grandnephews. It seems like she's always reaching out and gathering folks in. In fact, that's why she built this home, as large as it is so there would be room for family and friends.
I remember her always making bread. Whenever anybody comes over to the house, the first thing she wants to do is feed you. She wants to open up her whatever, open the fridge and start giving you, making sure you're comfortable, making sure that your needs, your physical needs are taken care of. And when you leave, is there something you can take with you? She was always making bread. She's the best bread maker that I know.
One of the fun things was sitting down in a fall dinner time and looking at the table, and most everything except the salt we had produced, the meat and the vegetables and the butter and the cream and the milk.
Many times we would just have bread and milk as our meal, just because we enjoyed eating bread and milk because it was so good. Fresh cow's milk and fresh made bread. It was great. My
mother is a gardener. My mother is someone who is always learning, which impresses me. And my mother is a giver. If you come to her house, you will leave with something, and mostly food, and something from her garden if the garden is in season. But she's always willing and wanting to give you something. She hasn't done her job unless she's given you something.
She's just a real hard worker. She has shouldered a lot of the responsibility when Dad's been off traveling, and has had to fill in for him to take care of the farm, to chase down the animals that would get loose, just to make sure that things kept running well. And she seemed to do it seamlessly. For us children looking at her, for me looking at her, it just seemed like that was part of what you do. When things need to be done, you just do them.
My mother is very patient, caring, and loving.
My mother endures vibrantly. She doesn't feel content to just grow old and fade away. And I think my living here in close proximity with her has been really special, because we get to see her close up and be with her on a daily basis and kind of watch her and observe her. She doesn't know this, but just the other night, she was practicing her voice. and she was singing and just, exercising her vocal cords, because it goes and it comes and goes, her voice sometimes. And some days she'll say, I just can't get a sound out. And other days, it's there. And so when it's there, she just exercises it. And she's not content to just kind of get in a rocking chair and just kind of grow old. She's just going to stay as vibrant as she can, for all the days that she has.
She is a graceful lady. She moves. She used to jump on the trampoline, even. And I think has always had good balance and physical dexterity. She used to ride horses. In fact, the last ride we went on, she was with Elder Grant Bangeter and his wife, and several of us went on a ride, and she was probably at least 80-something, 2 maybe at that point. And she said she'd even go again if we could help her up.
She was good at growing children, being kind and loving and patient and encouraging.
I remember learning from my dad so many things, and from my mom, canning and cooking and bread making and all of those things. And from my dad, the mechanical end of things and fixing things and creating things. And so I treasure that because I was able to pass that down to my own children.
People have described her all the time as being very graceful and very queenly. She's very, regal, and she's still able to go out into the garden and dig and, get her hands dirty, and, that doesn't stop her from doing things. But she's just always knows who she is, and I think she doesn't feel that that's how she is, but she is able to maintain that presence of being a child, a daughter of God, knowing who she is in spite of having to work with the pigs and the cows and doing all the stuff that she has had to do. She's been able to maintain that grace.
Elegant. She's someone who comes across very sincere and refined, yet very approachable.
Appreciator of beauty. I remember going outside and she'd say, Clary, how would you paint that mountain there? What colors would you use? And it helped me to look around and appreciate the beauty.
In Uruguay, when we had a maid, and she had a baby, but she still came to work. And one time around Christmas time, Mother asked if she couldn't drive the maid home. And what the maid didn't know is that we had gotten a big wash tin and filled it with canned goods and flour and sugar and other staples that you would need at a home, and some blankets. And since it was Christmas time, she had asked my little brothers to find a toy or two that they could put in this big tin, and she covered it with a blanket. Well, it was a gravel road, and then it was a dirt road, and then it was gullies. And finally she said, it's over there, and it was just a hovel. It was just sad. And so we kind of walked over the gullies and got to her house, and the missionaries were carrying the big tin with the blanket over it. And their husband was there taking care of this little newborn, and there were, I think, 2 other little children that were there. And then Mother announced that this was hers, and she took the blanket off and gave her the blanket. And the baby was in need of a bath, and so Mother took the little baby and showed both the husband and the mother how to wash the baby's head. That just showed who my mother was.
Her just being always there, knowing she was always one that I could always go to. Dad was never home, it seemed like. So Mom was just always available. being a typical boy, I think back, and I probably didn't make her life that easy. But she was very, very patient and forgiving and loving, and never spoke a sad or bad word to me or at me or about me that I can remember.
My mother is a wonderful supporter and kind of that trailblazer, preparing things so that Dad could fulfill his role.
To me, my mother had just this angelic voice, as a youngster. I just, the kind of voice that, was just, to me, the best voice in the world. And I remember going to our neighbors over here, the house is still there, but they're long gone, the Maryhues, and she would teach voice lessons to my mom. And I was really little. I mean, I was, crawling around, and maybe before school, before I was in kindergarten. And so, but I remember her practicing her singing, and she did have a very beautiful singing voice and would sing all the time. She would either humming or singing. That was just kind of a constant memory for us as children growing up.
She's just a beautiful lady. She's, for all of the hard work that she has to do, she still can clean up really beautifully and be as elegant and the wife of her husband, and make him proud.
I think of it in 4 categories. She loves, she lives, she learns, and she leaves a legacy. So her love is, as I indicated earlier, expansive. She doesn't put limits on who can be recipients of that love, and she reaches out to everyone. I remember a time we lived in Ecuador. She had a visiting teaching assignment with a local sister, and they would have to go quite a few miles to find their 4 or 5 families they visited. And rather than take the mission car, she would go on the bus with her local companion. And it would take all day, to do their visiting teaching. But she would do that, and she would do it faithfully and would look for ways to bless the lives of the families they taught.
It was important, and is important for her to have us gather together.
She always loves to get us together. She wants to keep bringing family together. She's always checking, have you called your brothers? Have you called your sisters? Have you done, have you made a connection? And always wanting to pull us together. And then she's just relentless in her ability to go out and do stuff. She loves to work in the yard. She loves to paint and express herself. And she wants to keep busy. And I think that's why she's lived so long, is she loves to be out in nature and get her hands in the dirt, and loves plants and flowers.
So she has a heart that's caring. She senses needs and responds to them, temporally, spiritually, emotionally, whatever is needed. Mom, I appreciate the fact that you are willing to learn new things and encourage me to do the same. I've come up with some pretty crazy ideas over the years, and you've never belittled my intent or desire to learn. You've supported me as much as you can, temporally and emotionally, spiritually, and I have felt the effect of your prayers in my behalf. I know that you pray for me and my children, and others that you love. And so, thank you.
Mom, I love you. I am so appreciative of the life that you've lived and the love that you've shared. And I am so glad that you're my mom. And I am I have so much appreciation for what you have done and what you've made out of your life, and for the beautiful woman that you are. I love you, Mom.
My mother is special. She's not filled in while Dad's been gone, but she's, again, just always been there, been available.
Mom, I love you. Thanks for your good example. Especially at this point in time where I'm now a general authority's wife, instead of just a daughter, it's a whole different thing. There is a lot more, it's just a different thing, a whole different thing. And I find that I am reflecting back a lot on what Mom did.
I thank my mom for being the wonderful example that she is in every aspect of life, in being a loving wife, supportive wife in every way, being a really wonderful mother, raising children that, love her and love to be in a family and love to do things, work, even if it's work, that's fine. That's life. And I so appreciate her talents that she has. Through all of the hardships of life, she still has developed her talents. She has a wonderful ability to paint with oils and watercolors. How wonderful to be able to develop your own talents and abilities while still raising a big family and having all of the responsibilities that she had being Dad's wife.
I love you, and I appreciate your qualities. Mom, you probably don't realize how important your role is. I feel like a little girl, like you say, from Morgan can hardly believe she's traveled the world, but you were destined for great things.
Mom, as your youngest and your only green-eyed and left-handed son, I love you, and I love everything about you and all that you've taught me and all that I've learned from you, in mostly in your example of dignity, of elegance, and farmhand knowledge. So while you can dance in the ball with the governor, and you can meet heads of state, and you can travel the world, you also know what it means to prepare meals for 16 hungry work hands on a ranch. You know what it means to ride horses. You know how to drive a plow horse. You have been through the array of life's experiences that goes from one extreme to the other, and yet you present yourself as humble, as dignified, as elegant in every way at age 90 as you did at age 40. And I just think that there is a great example of womanhood and motherhood that you present to the world. That is a legacy that we will continue to carry down and hand on to our children as something that you represent to us.
The life lesson that I've learned from my dad is compassion. And I would love to be able to pass that down to my kids. And the life lesson I've learned from my mother is giving. and being willing to serve. And just opening your doors, opening your heart to other people, and let them in.
Now, I said the family was the center of all of these things. It is. We had the family before we had the gospel. The purpose of the gospel, as I understand it, is to eternalize this family unit, this marriage of a husband and a wife, of a man and a woman, to eternalize that and make it an operative thing in the eternities to come as well as in this life. For it's in the home that most of the problems of this world will be settled. The closer we get to the home, the closer we're going to get to the solution of all the world problems. And the sooner we cease to look abroad and afar for the solution to our problems, the quicker we're going to come to solve them.